Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Phil Miller. I'm the director of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life here at the 92nd Street Y, and on behalf of the Y and the Bronfman Center, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. And I welcome our live audience here in New York City. But I must also, we're very special guests this evening. There are 8 communities around North America that are joining us this evening via satellite, and I'd like to welcome them now. If you'll give me just a second. I would like to welcome the Gordon JCC in Nashville, Tennessee, the JCC of Greater Albuquerque, the JCC of Omaha, the Jewish Educational Alliance in Savannah, Georgia, the Jewish Federation of Greater Charlotte, the Michael Ann Russell JCC in North Miami Beach, the Tucson JCC, and the Valley of the Sun JCC in Scottsdale, Arizona. Let's give them a big welcome in joining us this evening. Welcome, everyone. This is the annual Aaron Friedberg Bible Lecture, which the Bronfman Center is so proud to present each year, and I must recognize Dr. Philip and Jamila Weintraub, who are the sponsors of this lecture each year, and they are here with us this evening, and we thank them so much for all that they have done for the Bronfman Center and the 92nd Street Y. Our guest speaker this evening is someone who is a great friend of the 92nd Street Y and a remarkable figure in both the American Jewish community and throughout the world. Rabbi Harold S. Kushner is a rabbi laureate of Temple Israel in the Boston suburb of Natick, Massachusetts, after serving that congregation for 24 years. He's best known as the author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, an international bestseller first published in 1981. The book has been translated into 14 languages and was recently selected by members of the Book of the Month Club as one of the 10 most influential books of recent years. He has also written When All You Have Ever Wanted Isn't Enough, which was awarded the Christopher Medal for its contribution to the exaltation of the human spirit. His other books include When Children Ask About God, Who Needs God, To Life, and a 1996 bestseller, How Good Do We Have to Be? And with the late novelist Chaim Potok, he is co-author of the new conservative commentary on the Torah, Eitz Chaim, which has been enthusiastically received by hundreds of congregations since its publication in the fall of 2001. His book, Living a Life That Matters, was a fall of 2001 bestseller as well. And this is the most important part. Rabbi Kushner was born in Brooklyn, New York, and graduated from Columbia University. He was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1960 and awarded a doctoral degree in Bible by the seminary in 1972. He also has 6 honorary doctorates. In 1999, the national organization, Religion in American Life, honored him as their Clergyman of the Year. His topic this evening will be Psalms, the ancient songs of the Spirit. Now, before I welcome Rabbi Kushner to the stage, just a few quick housekeeping notes. For our audience here in New York, as you came in this evening, you received index cards from our ushers. And I encourage you, as Rabbi Kushner is giving his presentation, to fill out index cards, those index cards with questions that you have for him. And those in communities who are joining us around North America, you know how to get in touch with us by fax or by email, and I encourage you to start sending in those questions now. At the conclusion of Rabbi Kushner's talk, I will join him again here on stage, and I will pepper him with your questions, and he will share with us his answers. Also, everyone both here and around North America tonight should have received, as you came in, a copy of the 23rd Psalm, which Rabbi Kushner will be teaching this evening as part of his talk. Finally, last bit of housekeeping. Rabbi Kushner will be in our art gallery immediately adjacent to our concert hall following his talk this evening. His books will be on sale, and he'll be available to sign those books and to meet all of you who are here with us in New York. It is now my pleasure and honor to welcome again to the 92nd Street Y, Rabbi Harold Kushner.
Thank you, Rabbi Miller, and good evening. Thank you to all of you who are tuned in live or by satellite. I have to say, first of all, how exciting it always is for me to be here speaking at the 92nd Street Y. It is such a very special institution. Periodically, I run across this multi-page series of notices in the New York Times about the programmings they have here. It's just an astonishing array of programs, and I feel very honored to be part of it, and makes me almost wish I was back living in New York. And to those of you who are seeing me on satellite, first of all, a very special word of good evening to all of you at the Tucson Jewish Community Center. My wife and I were in Tucson just about 10 days ago on vacation. We love it. We go there every January for reasons that you will readily understand. For those of you watching in North Miami Beach, we're going to be down there beginning next Sunday for the month of February. Our daughter and our grandchildren and our son-in-law live in Miami. We spend as much time with them as we can. And to those of you watching at that wonderful, magnificent Jewish Community Center in Omaha, Nebraska, my wife is from Omaha, grew up there. Her parents were Sylvia and Dave Estrada, very active and fondly remembered at Bethel. And we have very fond feelings toward Omaha. And for the rest of you, I just want to make sure that if you're watching on satellite TV instead of live here in New York, please don't feel like second-class citizens. My congregants back in Massachusetts get to see me live all the time, and when they see me on television, they get very excited. The book of Psalms has a very unique place on the shelf of Jewish classic spiritual literature. For one thing, if you realize, it is the only book of the Bible that God did not write. Think about it. Everything else in the Bible, the Lord spoke to Moses, and the Lord said, and thus says the Lord, and the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. It's all God's words to us. The book of Psalms is the only instance in the Bible of our words directed to God. And what are those words that we find directed to God in the 150 chapters, the devotional literature of the book of Psalms? More than anything else, what we find in the Psalms is the Israelites' articulation of the joy and the privilege of coming into God's presence. In my synagogue in Natick, Massachusetts, on the front wall alongside the ark, we have inscribed a line from Psalm 26, Adonai ahavti ma'on beitecha, Lord, I love coming into your house. We have it in Hebrew because if we had it in English, the congregants probably would feel it was the height of hypocrisy. They walk into synagogue with the expression that they usually reserve for going to the dentist's office. But the psalmists, the people who wrote the Psalms, felt it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to them, to come into the presence of God. We find in the Psalms a typically Jewish idea, but very much worth calling your attention to, the legitimacy of being angry at God. You don't find that in every religion, but you find it in the book of Psalms. Lord, how long will your anger be kindled against us? How long will you permit the wicked to triumph over the righteous? When are you going to get around to doing something about this terrible mixed-up world? You find that. Religious people saying something very religious. And what is the religious message they're articulating? God, you are not living up to your promises. You're not living up to what it means to be God. Get with it. The Psalms can be individual or collective, phrased in the singular or phrased in the plural. They can be words of praise. They can be words of lament. And I must tell you, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the history of the composition of the book of Psalms. Spent about 2 years writing it, and it messed up my davening life. I mean, I'd be at the minyan, I'm trying to read the Psalms, and my head is saying, oh yes, this is a communal lament, except for lines 5 and 6, which were added at a later date. And only when I finally finished the dissertation could I get back to actually praying instead of studying Psalms. Why were they written? Where did they come from? There are two theories, and they're probably both probable. Either they were just written, composed, to give the average Israelite the opportunity to put his thoughts and feelings into words. Or they were written so that the average Israelite could feel like a participant at the temple service. It seems unmistakable that many of the Psalms were composed to be recited at the temple as the daily offerings were being brought. The offerings, of course, were carried out by the priests. The people who brought the offerings, the worshipers, had no active role. And maybe they didn't want to be purely passive. Maybe what they craved was a sense of ownership of the religious service at the temple. And reciting the Psalms, or even having them recited by the Levites, the singing, the choirs, on their behalf, while the priests carried out their work in silence, made them feel involved. And behind it all, every single one of the 150 chapters in the book of Psalms is suffused with the confidence of the ancient Israelites that there is a God, that this God cares about what happens to us, and that makes their life in this vulnerable, dangerous, unpredictable world possible. And with that, I want to transition to the text we're going to study this evening, line by line. Probably the only chapter of the entire Bible that many of you know by heart. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." For many years, when I was a congregational rabbi, I found myself wondering, to what question is the 23rd Psalm an answer? I would recite it at funerals, I would recite it at Yizkor services, and it was always a source of amazement, no matter how tragic the circumstance, no matter how grievous the funeral, no matter how raw people's emotions were. I would begin to recite those familiar words of the 23rd Psalm, and it had this tranquilizing effect on the entire congregation. It just comforted people. It made them feel better. To what question is it the answer? I finally decided it's an answer to the question, where do I find the courage to live in this crazy world? Whether it was a personal source of grief, a personal loss, rejection, tragedy, whether it was a wider one, the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001, the attack on a commuter bus in Israel this morning, whatever the event, when we see things that happen to decent people, when we learn how life hangs by a fragile thread, how do you get the strength and the faith to wake up tomorrow morning and go back about your duties? How do you get the courage to send your children off to school and know that you can look forward to seeing them again? Psalm 23 is the answer to that. I'd like to take our time tonight and just take a close look at the psalm, virtually line by line. It's short. It's an immensely compact masterpiece. In Hebrew, there are only 51 words. That's the whole psalm, 51 words in Hebrew, about 120 in English, depending on exactly which translation you're using. But within this 51 words composition, it says so much. I've come to see the 23rd Psalm as a drama in 3 acts. Act 1, the psalmist finds himself in a perfect, placid, safe, orderly, sun-drenched world. Everything is fine. Green pastures and still waters and everything he could possibly want. When I was traveling around the country talking about my book on the 23rd Psalm, The Lord is My Shepherd, in 3 separate cities in 3 different parts of the country, somebody asked me the same question. It wasn't exactly a question. The questioner said, I don't like this psalm. I don't like this psalm because it begins, the Lord is my shepherd. And if the Lord is my shepherd, that means I'm a sheep, and I don't like being told I'm a sheep. Said to the questioner, first of all, give me a break. This is a poem. You don't take a poem literally. A poem uses imagery to get its point across, and you don't take the image literally. Secondly, all right, the psalmist starts out saying, the Lord is my shepherd. That is, there is a God out there who takes care of all of my needs so nothing bad will happen to me. That's where he begins. That's not where he ends up. He ends up with a much more nuanced understanding of God's role in his life. And third, even when he comes to understand what God's role in our lives is, there's a part of him that still wants to be taken care of. There's a part of him that remains a child that craves that sense of there's somebody out there looking out for me. That's what he means, the Lord is my shepherd. Why green pastures? There's an old Jewish joke about the father and little boy who are going for a walk in the park. And the boy says to his father, Daddy, why is the sky blue? The father says, I don't know, the sky's blue. It's always been blue. What color do you expect sky to be? 2 minutes later, the boy asks him, Daddy, why is the grass green? The father says, what kind of question is that? Grass is green. If it wasn't green, it wouldn't be grass. 2 minutes later, the boy says, Daddy, do you mind my asking you all these questions? The father says, no, go ahead and ask. How else are you going to learn? But maybe there is a reason why the grass is green and the sky is blue. Bright colors, red, white, orange, they assault the eye. You can't miss them. That's why rental cars are either white or red, if you ever noticed. Hospital rooms used to be painted stark white as a sign of purity, of cleanliness. And then somebody realized that stark white walls make the patients anxious. And now if you go to a hospital, the walls are probably going to be light green or pale blue, because those are colors that relax us. So why is the grass green and the sky blue and the trees brown? Because God painted his world in colors that would let us relax. That's why when you have a long weekend, you want to go out to the shore, you want to go to the mountains, you want to buy a house with a large lawn, a house with a water view, you're going to pay extra for it, because those greens and blues relax us. Bright colors, neon signs, they stimulate us, they keep us awake. God's colors let us relax. And the psalmist sees himself in green pastures, still waters, everything is safe, everything is calm. That's Act 1. The world is perfect, I shall not want, there's nothing I would change in it. And then suddenly the psalmist in Act 2 finds himself thrown out of the sunshine into the darkness. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. What an incredible metaphor that is, the shadow of death. Because the psalmist understands it's not the experience of death that terrifies us. By then it's too late. It's the knowledge that we are going to die that casts a shadow over every day of our lives. The woman whose mother and aunt have died of breast cancer, she knows what it means to live in the valley of the shadow of death. A gay man in America, conscious at all times that he is one blood test away from being told he has a life-threatening disease. He knows what it means to live in the valley of the shadow of death. My father had his first stroke when he was 79 years old. Fortunately, it was a mild one. Physically, he recovered completely. No speech impediments, no motor functions disrupted. He lived for 6 years after that. But he didn't really live. He was never the same person after that first stroke, because he lived every day of those last 6 years in the valley of the shadow of death, waiting. Every tremor, every headache, every muscle pain terrified him that this might be another stroke that would send him over the edge. To know that anything, any time now, something can happen to you that will cost you your life, makes us look at time and choice and everything else differently. Last April, the conservative rabbis from all over the continent, in fact all over the world, gathered in Los Angeles for our annual convention. And one of our really gifted colleagues gave a brilliant paper on the question, what happened in the Garden of Eden? What was the knowledge that Adam and Eve acquired when they ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What did they learn which is both good and bad? His suggestion, they learned that they were mortal. They learned that one day they would die, and that made them different from all the other animals. If you remember your Bible, chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, God says to them, don't eat the fruit, because the day you eat of the fruit, you will die. Yes? Well, they eat it. They don't die. But they learn they're going to die, and that colors every subsequent day of their life. If you remember in the Bible, what happens the very first thing after Adam and Eve have eaten that fruit? They realize that they are naked, and they're ashamed. May I remind you, there is literally nobody in the world to see them? Literally, there is nobody in the world who can see them. What are they embarrassed by? They're embarrassed to have bodies. They're embarrassed to have bodies because it is their bodies that will one day betray them. Their bodies that make them vulnerable to sickness, to disease, to illness and accident and injury. And if it weren't for our bodies, we wouldn't be in the valley of the shadow of death. But the psalmist, something has happened to him which has taken him out of the sunlight and into the valley of the shadow. Or maybe it's not something that happened to him. Maybe it's something that happened to somebody close to him. Somebody he loved died. And suddenly the light has gone out of his life. And he finds himself shadowed by the experience of this death. And that's why I have come to understand that maybe the most important single word in the entire 23rd Psalm is one that we really don't pause. We skip right over it when we recite the Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. In my congregational experience, I've known a lot of people who had suffered reverses, rejections, losses. Somebody close to them had died. And I've seen so many of them get stuck in the valley of the shadow. They remain in the darkness. They just never permit themselves to laugh and enjoy life again. The woman whose husband dies and her entire identity is absorbed in being a widow. All she can talk about is how lonely it is to be without a husband. The parents who lose a child, as my wife and I did 26 years ago, and it becomes their entire identity. It becomes all they can think about and talk about. And I look at these people and I wonder, why are they stuck in the shadow? Why don't they find their way out of it? And the conclusion I came to, sometimes people remain in the valley of the shadow because maybe when they were young, somebody, a parent, a teacher, or a religious leader told them that they were no good and nothing good would ever come of their lives, and they believed it, and they think this is the punishment they deserve. But most of the time, I think people remain in the valley of the shadow because they're afraid. Because they're afraid that if they ever permitted themselves to get over the loss and recover and be happy again, they would lose their loved one permanently. Death took him out of their lives physically, and if they ever let themselves get over the loss, that would take the person out of their lives emotionally. And I would try and explain to these people that, no, that's not the way it works. When you have loved somebody, no matter what happens to that person has entered so permanently into the fabric of your soul that you can never be separated from him. That memory will always be there. You don't have to be afraid that you will lose touch. What I now say to gatherings of bereaved parents is, when your child died and you inherited his books and his toys and his stereo, one of the things you inherited from the child who died is all his unlived years, and they should be a precious legacy. Live those years that he never got around to live. Don't say, how can I go out and enjoy the world when he's not here to share it with me? Go out and live those years on his behalf. The psalmist who once praised God as his shepherd, the one who would always take care of him, the psalmist now has a new understanding of God. Once he found out that God could not protect him from the bad things that happen in the world. I had a teacher, Mordecai Kaplan, in rabbinical school, who used to say, expecting the world to treat you fairly because you're a good person is like expecting the bull not to charge you because you're a vegetarian. The psalmist, the author of the 23rd Psalm, has come to understand God's role is not to protect him from bad things. God's role is to find him in the valley of the shadow of death and make sure he doesn't stay there, to give him the strength and the will and the courage, step by step, to find his way out of the valley of the shadow to where the sun is shining again. Because what is a shadow? A shadow is something you see only if the sun is behind you. And what God does is say, turn around, turn your back to the shadow, and you will find yourself in the sunshine again. This is what God does. In times of tragedy, of misfortune, times when events throw us into the valley of the shadow of death, God does not explain, God does not justify, God comforts. That is the authentic voice of religion. Not to make sense of what happened, not to tell you you deserve it, you'll be better off for it, but to comfort. There's a scene in the Torah in the book of Exodus right after the Israelites have crossed the Red Sea. They're wandering in the desert, they're thirsty, they see an oasis, they can hardly wait to get there and drink the fresh water. They arrive, they can't drink the water, it's polluted, it's brackish. In the Torah, God shows Moses a certain tree. Moses cuts a few branches off the tree, throws it into the pool, it purifies the water, and they can drink it. That's the story in the Torah. The Midrash, the rabbinic commentary on that story, has the following imaginary dialogue between God and Moses. It pictures Moses saying to God, God, would you explain to me what's the point of making brackish water in the world? I mean, who needs polluted water that doesn't do anybody any good? And while you're at it, God, would you explain to me what precisely did you have in mind when you invented mosquitoes and cockroaches and gypsy moths and termites? Wouldn't the world be just as well off without them? And God says, Moses, this is not a time for theology. This is not a time for wondering why I do or don't do certain things. You got people who are dying over there. You got people who are desperately thirsty. Make them feel better. We'll talk about the theology some other time. That's what religion does. Religion doesn't explain to you why you deserve it and you'll be better off. Religion comforts you in your pain. Religion finds you in the valley of the shadow and shows you how to find your way out to the sunlight again. I remember years ago I read a book by a Christian ethicist by the name of Stanley Hauerwas. It was about religion and mental retardation, and he's got one great line in that book. He writes, confronting a retarded child, the question a religious person should ask is not, why does God permit this? The question a religious person should ask is, what kind of community should we be so that child can lead a fulfilling life? That's the authentic voice of religion. This is what the psalmist never understood before until he found himself in the valley of the shadow. And when he discovers he is capable of finding his way through the valley of the shadow and coming out the other side, he realizes this is what God has done for him. That's Act 2. The third act, the last third of the psalm, is the psalmist's tribute to what he has just learned about God and what he wants to share with us so we will learn it too. If you look at your text, you'll see it line by line. What comes right after that? After he finds his way out of the shadow, what does he write about? Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Now, you've got to be a shepherd to understand that line. It's probably lost on a lot of contemporary readers. The shepherd would use his staff to help stumbling, falling lambs. A sheep trips and falls into the brook. The shepherd uses his staff to extricate it. A little lamb gets stuck in the mud. The shepherd uses his staff to pull him out, as well as to lean on it himself. And the shepherd's rod, a phrase, a metaphor used, an image used very often in the Bible, the rod was to punish the sheep that were getting out of line and make sure that they behaved themselves. So when I read that line, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me, what I hear the psalmist testifying to is this. He says, there are two things that happen in the world that convince me that God is real and not just a bit of wishful thinking. When I see good people stumble and fall, and from somewhere they find the strength to pick themselves up and go on. When I see people come up with these incredible resources of resiliency, that's God at work. That's the shepherd's staff helping the falling. And he says, when I see bad people get what they deserve, that's the rod of God coming down on them. In the last 22 years, I have lost track of how many people have come up to me and said, hey, Rabbi, I got a great idea for your next book. Why don't you write a book called When Good Things Happen to Bad People? Because that's what really bothers me. They say to me, I suppose you're right that if you're a sensitive, caring person, you're not going to make it through life without events hurting you. It makes sense. And I think I can go along when you say that God's role is not to weave a magic circle around me and my family and protect us from what happens to everybody else. Okay. What I can't understand is if there is so much grief and anguish in the world, couldn't some of it land on my neighbor who deserves it? Why do bad people get away with murder? Why do wicked people prosper? My answer is they don't. My answer is you pay for everything you take in this life in one currency or another. And if it's not public embarrassment and jail time, it is losing the opportunity to know what it feels like to be a fully realized, authentic human being. When I was a boy growing up in Brooklyn in the 1940s, we did not know that smoking was bad for your health. I remember ball players doing ads for cigarettes. I remember doctors doing ads for cigarettes. Well, we learned that smoking can take years off your life, and now we try and encourage people not to smoke. What if, in the next couple of years, science were to discover that lying was like smoking? That every time you told a lie, it did something to your cardiovascular system. It's not so implausible. That's how a lie detector works. Every time you told a lie, it would shorten your life by 1 minute. Why? Because God has made the world in such a way that just as our bodies have to behave and take note of what we eat and drink and how much exercise we get. Our souls are made so that certain behavior nourishes the soul, keeps it healthy, and other kinds of behavior is toxic to the soul. A couple of years ago, I read the second volume of Robert Caro's magisterial biography of Lyndon Johnson. It's the one about the Senate years. And what I remember about reading that book, Johnson has his serious heart attack when he was majority leader of the Senate in the 1950s, almost dies. He has his heart attack not when he is working hard. He is capable, like every one of us, of working incredibly hard. He has it when he is working deceitfully, when he's telling one senator, don't listen to what I'm saying over there, I'm really on your side. And then he turns around and says to the other senators, no, I'm with you, I'm only pretending to be with them, until he's lost track of which lie he's told to which group of senators. No wonder he gets sick. Human bodies were not made to tell lies. Human bodies were not made to be selfish and deceitful and mean. We are meant to be honest and cheerful and generous and cooperative, and when we do that, we just feel good. This is the staff of God reaching out to people who need sustenance, and the rod of God coming down on people who need to be brought back into line. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. How did that line get in the psalm? I mean, here you've got this wonderful, optimistic, deeply spiritual psalm about how helpful God is and how much I appreciate it. And all of a sudden, in the middle of it, we encounter this line, God, thank you for treating me better than you treat all those people I'm feuding with. You know what it sounds like? It sounds like the attitude of the guy who says, I'm going to my 30th high school reunion only to see what happens when I pull up in my new BMW and all the girls who wouldn't date me will eat their hearts out for what they missed out on. It sounds so mean-spirited, so ungenerous. What do you do with that line, thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies? If any of you are familiar with Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, a wonderful sage and teacher, he has an interesting take on that. What he says in one of his books is, once a year, he convenes an imaginary dinner party, all in his mind. And to this imaginary dinner party, he invites everybody he's angry at, everybody he's feuding with, everybody he's having a fight with. And in this imaginary dinner party, he goes around the table one at a time and thanks every one of his guests for what they've taught him. Some people he thanks for teaching him not to expect too much of people, that people are going to have their own concerns, their own well-being in mind, and he better get used to it. Some of them he thanks for what they've taught him about himself. They've forced him to ask himself, why did that person get under my skin? Why did she upset me so much? She didn't think she was doing anything monstrous. What hot button did she touch that bothers me? And what do I learn about myself so that I'm not so easily upset? That's Reb Zalman's take on that line. I've got a slightly different one. I noticed that in Hebrew, the word which is translated in the presence of mine enemies, the word is neged tzorodai. Neged usually means opposite, and opposite can mean in contrast to. And I find the line saying, God, you nourished me spiritually when I was in the valley of the shadow. You nourished me spiritually in contrast to my human friends who could not give me what I needed. You know what happens when something bad happens to you. Somebody you love dies. You lose someone. You get some major rejection. You're fired. Something terrible happens to you. You feel empty inside. You feel empty right here, and people have to come and fill that emptiness. You know, we have this wonderful custom in Judaism. Somebody you love dies. You go to the funeral. You go to the cemetery. When you come back to the cemetery, what's been going on at home? Your friends have been there setting out this spread of bagels and cream cheese and coffee in Danish. Not because you need the calories, because you need the expression of love which all that food incarnates. At a time when you have been struck down, you need to be told that there are people who care about you, who love you, who are there for you. But you know, sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes you turn to your friends in your time of emptiness and need, and either you are so needy that you scare them off, or they are so sensitive because you remind them this can happen to them that they run away. And the psalmist says, when I found myself hurled into the valley of the shadow of death, and I turned to my friends around me to reassure me that I was okay, that I had not been abandoned in the valley, and they weren't there for me. God, you found me there. You found me and took me by the hand and led me through the valley, and I'll never forget it. That's what saved me when everybody else didn't know what I needed. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. Once again, a very difficult line for a contemporary reader to understand. It sounds like something that goes on at the beauty parlor. The ancient reader would have understood immediately what that image is, to anoint somebody's head with oil. What does it mean? It means to mark somebody as special. You know the word Messiah? You know the word Christ? Those are the Hebrew and Greek equivalents of being anointed with oil. That's what the word Messiah means, the one who has had oil poured on his head to designate him as having special responsibilities. The psalmist is saying, when you found me in the valley of the shadow, and I felt so alone and rejected, and you cared enough to take me by the hand and lead me out, God, you made me feel that I was special to you, and I've never forgotten it. And I think that imposes an obligation on me to do something for you in return. Harvey Cox teaches the history of Christian thought at Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's a devout Christian, married to a Jewish woman, raising their son as Jewish. And a couple of years ago, he wrote a charming little book called Common Prayers, in which he describes the experience of being a Christian in a Jewish family, going through all the holidays of the Jewish year. And it's really interesting to see how those holidays appear to him through the eyes of a devout Christian. I thought the most interesting chapter was the one about Passover, with all of its Christological implications. You know that scene at the Seder right after the meal where you open the door for Elijah? When I was a boy growing up in Hebrew school, I was taught that Elijah is the messenger of the Messiah, and you open the door and you wait for the year when Elijah will be there and he will say, this is it, this is the year, this is when the Messiah is going to come and make everything fine. And for many years as a rabbi, that's what I would teach my congregation. Passover comes in the spring, the world is coming to life again, the flowers are appearing, the baseball season's starting, everybody's full of optimism, and we're ready to be told this is the year when everything's going to get fixed. Harvey Cox writes that he has a different take on this. He says, you know, when you've done that 4, 5, 6 years in a row, and Elijah is never there, isn't it time you got the message he isn't coming? Elijah is not coming. And the Messiah isn't coming either, and you've got to be the Messiah. You want to make this world better? You do something about it. A child's understanding of a mess is to cry so somebody will come and fix it for him. A mature adult says, I didn't make that mess, but I have to live here, so I'm going to do something to make this a little bit better. Thou anointest my head with oil means, God, you have given me the ability to do some special things, and one of them is to make this world a nicer world for your residents. My cup runneth over. Gratitude. That's what that line is about. My cup is overflowing with blessings. I would insist gratitude is the fundamental religious emotion. It is the one religious emotion I could expect of people who are not conventionally religious. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to have any kind of theological commitment to be capable of gratitude. It's simply a way of being aware that things have fallen into your lap that you did not earn and could not have arranged for. And the proper response is to be grateful. You know, there are few more exasperating things than buying a present for a person, giving it to him, having him look at it and say, I really wanted something more expensive. I mean, you want to strangle a guy like that. Isn't that what we do when we take a look at the givens of our lives? The circumstances of our birth, the abilities we're born with, how good-looking we are, how intelligent, how athletic we are. And instead of being grateful, we say, you know, I wish I were better looking. I wish I were smarter. I wish I were born to wealthier parents. This is to receive a gift and say, gee, I wanted a nicer one. That's not very nice. That's a terribly rude thing to do. What is fascinating about the sense of gratitude, in the book, I quote the British poet W.H. Auden, who has a wonderful line. He says, weather is what nasty people are nasty about and nice people celebrate. Isn't that great, especially this week in New York when we got 10 inches of slush outside the front door? There are people who complain about the weather, not because the weather is nasty, but because they're complainers. And there are people who have the capacity to look out and say, gee, that's beautiful. And if it's not beautiful, it's good for the flowers. And if it's not good for the flowers, it's still what happens in January. And what do you expect if you're going to live in New York in January? People are grateful not because they've been luckier than everybody else. They're grateful because their eyes are open to just how lucky they are. If I get personal for a moment, every night before I go to bed, I have to put eye drops on my eyes to fend off incipient glaucoma. And every morning with breakfast, I take a pill to control my blood pressure. And every night with dinner, I take another pill to lower my cholesterol. I could contemplate that and just kvetch about how I'm not as young as I used to be and my body isn't capable of doing things it used to do. But that's not how I respond. I respond with a sense of, boy, am I lucky that I lived long enough to achieve the illnesses of old age. A lot of my relatives never lived long enough to do that. And when I did get to the point where I have all these things going wrong with me, at least there's a pill the doctors can give me to try and control it and make it feel better. One can respond with gratitude. One can respond with a sense of all the good things that have fallen into your life. And you know what's fascinating? What's fascinating is the psalmist writes that line, my cup runneth over, not when everything is going well for him. He writes it after he has passed through the valley of the shadow. Only when he has found out how vulnerable all his blessings are, only when he finds out, when he is made to realize they can be taken away from him, only then does he appreciate how truly blessed he is. And one more line I would look at with you. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Before I analyze that line, I have to tell you something. You understand it is impossible to translate poetry. You simply cannot do it. The essence of a poem, the words have to be so carefully chosen, the essence of a poem will inevitably be lost when you move from one language to another. You simply cannot translate poetry. But the translators of the King James Bible did it. They translated the masterpiece in Hebrew into a masterpiece in English. And in some cases, the English is even better at expressing the Hebrew than the original Hebrew was. The original Hebrew probably does not talk about the valley of the shadow of death. Gate Salmavet, probably Gate Salamut, a valley, a very deep, dark valley. But you know, the psalmist chose a word for darkness, not your typical biblical word for darkness. He chose a word for darkness that has echoes of death, mavet, in it. And the translators very sensitively picked this up. They did a wonderful job, better than anybody could have anticipated. This line is the one place where they blew it. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Because the Hebrew doesn't say follow. Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni. Goodness and mercy will chase me. That's what the Hebrew says. They will pursue me all the days of my life. It's like the Hasidic story of the rabbi who says to one of his prominent congregants, you know, whenever I see you, you're always rushing. You're always running here, running there. I've been meaning to ask you, where are you always running? And the man says, I'm running after success. I'm running after prosperity. I'm running after making a good living. And the rabbi says, okay, that's a good answer. If you assume all those blessings are in front of you trying to avoid you and you got to run hard to catch them, what if they're behind you? What if they're behind you trying to catch up with you and they can't because you're running so fast? What if God has all sorts of wonderful presents he wants to deliver, but you're never home to receive them? There are some blessings you will only attain if you work hard. You want your marriage to be strong? You can't count on it to happen just by itself. You've got to work at it. You want to be a good parent to your children? It's going to take a lot of hard work. You want to be successful in your chosen profession? You're probably going to have to work hard at that also. But then there are blessings which will come your way, not when you chase after them, but only when you slow down and stop and let them find you. And among them are goodness and mercy. Goodness, I would interpret as feeling good about yourself, liking who you are. If in order to feel good about yourself, you have to reach a certain level of achievement, make a certain amount of money, achieve a certain title, win a certain award, it's never going to be enough. Because when you finally get there, you will still have to satisfy yourself, well, I've got to go to the next rung and just reassure myself this wasn't a fluke. The only way you'll ever get to feeling good about yourself is just to say, I'm fine. I don't need it. I don't need recognition. I don't need a title. I don't need a letter from somebody. I don't need a plaque. I like myself the way I am. That's goodness, and goodness finding you wherever you are. And mercy, an important biblical word, chesed, usually translated unearned love, as if there was any other kind of love. You can't talk somebody into loving you. You tried that in high school and it never worked. Chesed, the sense that God gives you the benefit of the doubt, that God loves you enough to put up with you despite your shortcomings. You can't persuade God that you deserve his love. All you can do is just stop and let it find you. Goodness and mercy will find you, will run after you, will chase you down all the days of your life. When you're young, when you're a teenager and terribly insecure about who you are and what you're good for and what your life is going to turn out to be, and will you ever get married, and who will you marry, and will you be good at anything that you can make a living at? God's goodness and mercy find you. When you're a middle-aged man and woman and you have to confront the terrifying reality that you've done as much as you're ever going to do, God's goodness and mercy are there to reassure you that you're as good as you need to be. You don't need further achievements. You don't need more accomplishments. You're fine. And when you've come to the last stages of your life and you look back either with satisfaction or with disappointment, God's goodness and mercy can find you there and let you feel good about yourself. And it's not only God's goodness and mercy finding you, it's the qualities of goodness and mercy that you will have for others. That you will not spend your middle years jealous of people who are passing you by, and you will not spend the last part of your life looking back with resentment on people who are younger and still have things that you've lost. I want to share with you just the last page or so out of my book to summarize what I think the 23rd Psalm is about. It's a hymn written by a man who started out believing in a God who is his shepherd, a God who takes care of him, a God who makes it possible for him to wake up in the morning and not be afraid that anything bad will happen to him. But then one day something bad happens to him, and he comes to understand God in a much more mature way. God with whom he can have an almost peer relationship. A God who cares about him even if he can't protect him, to find him in the valley of the shadow and lead him through it. And he pledges the rest of his life to try to do something for God the way God has done for him. And this is how my book on the 23rd Psalm concludes. When events in our world bring us dismay, and we fear that evil is prospering, God reminds us that evil acts invariably carry the seeds of their own destruction. When people disappoint us, when they can't give us what we need, whether because our needs are too great or because their emotional resources are too meager, God is our reliable friend, an inexhaustible source of love and strength. When we find ourselves wandering aimlessly through the world, wondering why we're here and what our lives will have meant when they're over, God blesses us with a sense of purpose, a challenge, a list of moral obligations and opportunities, every one of which will give us the sense of living our days in his presence. There is pain in the world. If we are to be truly alive, we can't hide from it, but we can survive it. And God's caring presence lessens the pain. There is death in the world, robbing us of the ones we love and one day robbing them of our presence. But God, who is immortal, assures us that death may take a person out of our future, but cannot remove him from our past. That all the things we loved a person for have entered so deeply into our souls that they remain part of us. The Lord gives, but the Lord does not take away. Their presence is every bit as real today as their absence. There is fear in the world. There is vulnerability and uncertainty. God can't tell us that nothing bad will ever happen to us. But God can tell us that we need not be afraid of the future no matter what it holds. He can't protect us from evil without taking away from other people the human power of choosing between good and bad. He can't protect you from illness or bad luck. He can't spare you from death and let you and those around you live forever. But he can give you the resources to transcend and overcome those fears, so that bad luck never causes you to lose faith in yourself, so that bad people never cause you to lose faith in humanity, so that the inevitability of death never causes you to give up on the holiness of life. There will be dark days, days of loss and days of failure, but they will not last forever. The light will always return to chase away the darkness. The sun will always come out again after the rain, and the human spirit will always rise above failure. Fear will assault us, but we will not be afraid, for thou art with me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Kushner. That was beautiful. We have a number of different questions, really spanning all kinds of issues, from some somewhat technical, textual issues to really some of the most essential questions of the meaning of life. So I'll start with the technical, textual, and work up to the big $64,000 questions. The first question is about translation. And clearly, that's how, for many of us, that's our access to Psalms or the Bible as a whole. And the question here is, please talk about modern translations of the 23rd Psalm, which this particular person finds takes all the joy, meaning, and pleasure out of it. And clearly the emphasis here seems on modern translations as opposed to the more, I guess, King James and some others.
You know, that's really interesting, Rabbi Miller. 2,000 years ago, when the Hebrew Bible was first being translated into Greek and other accessible languages, but Greek and Latin mostly, this is exactly what happened. There were earlier translations, earlier versions. When St. Jerome translated the Vulgate, the original Latin translation, he had to keep the older Latin translation of the Psalms, even though he came up with a new Latin translation of every other book in the Hebrew and Christian Bible, because people wouldn't put up with it. Every place else in the Bible, we want to get rid of the Baguettes and the these and thous and have it accessible. When it comes to our book, the book we wrote, the one book God did not write, we don't want accuracy, we want magic. We want music, we want poetry. We don't want to be told, when it comes to the laws and the stories and the prophets, we need to be told exactly what God had in mind. When it comes to putting into words the deepest emotions of our souls, we don't want accuracy. We want to sing, we want to soar, we want the poetry. I feel the same way the questioner does. The modern translations that feel obliged to improve on the King James, not an improvement. I crave the familiar, I crave the comforting cadences, the magic. The 20th and 21st centuries are a wonderful time for building computers and a very bad time for writing poetry. So I think we ought to leave it to the people of the 16th century to do the poetry writing.
Okay. We hope we don't have any poets here this evening. This was also this is a technical question also, but just similarly, the Hebrew obviously for Psalms is Tehillim. But one questioner asked, the word Psalms, where does that come from?
It's a Greek word for song.
Huh.
As Tehillah is more specifically, Tehillah probably means a song of praise. But Psalms is Greek for songs in general.
Next question also is a textual question and a historical question. You touched on it at the beginning, but the question asked in terms of authorship of the book of Psalms. And just like who wrote the book of love, this question is who wrote the book of Psalms, and is there an author? Do you imagine King David when you read, or who are you imagining when you read the Psalms?
First, I don't know who wrote it. Second, neither does anybody else. The Psalms were written at a time where I am absolutely convinced the concept of individual authorship did not apply. In the same way that we today say it takes a village to raise a child, people of the biblical world said it takes a culture to write a poem. It would have been an unacceptable act of chutzpah for one person to say, I wrote this, and deny the contributions of his teachers and his neighbors and his parents and of God and of the Holy Spirit. They would say, this is in the air, this is what we were all feeling, and it was just my opportunity to put it into words. There is a tradition that King David wrote it. Psalms are very often, including the 23rd Psalm, begins a Psalm of David. What does that mean? It's not impossible that David wrote some Psalms. I'm sure he wrote several. Whether we find them in the biblical book of Psalms is impossible to know. But the prophet Amos, who lived only a couple of generations after David, remembers David as a singer and composer. But a Psalm of David could mean a psalm in the style that King David wrote. It could mean a psalm dedicated to the current king of the Judea, a descendant of David. It could mean a psalm in honor of King David, any or all of those things. But the Psalms are anonymous. They are the product of a people who wanted to express the very deep, heartfelt joy of being permitted to come into the presence of God.
We now begin to expand a bit to some of the larger questions which people asked. You talked about the notion of this, which on the surface, the line which is on the surface very, very puzzling to most modern readers. Thou anointest my head with oil. It's again something my 4-year-old might do that all the time, but again, pouring oil over her head is something very foreign to us. When you talked about the idea of a Messiah and how each of us, I think you talked about each of us acting as a Messiah. But the question asked, what is your belief about the Messianic era? And will there be a time that a Messiah, a singular Messiah, will come and bring them that era in?
You know what's interesting is that Jewish theology has never been terribly specific about this. There is a range of opinion as to what the Messianic era will be. As a rule of thumb, the worse things were in this life, the more extravagant our images of the Messianic era becomes. Maimonides, for example, said the Messianic era will be different from the current era in only one small way, that Israel will become an independent power again and not subject to dispersion among the Gentiles, which is why the official prayer that we recite for the state of Israel refers to it as Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulatenu, the beginning of the Messianic redemption. Because for the Jews to be redeemed from exile and again have a sovereign Jewish state is Maimonides' definition of the Messiah. At the opposite extreme, at the most extravagant and significant change, there is this more or less Kabbalistic view that history is divided into 3 acts. There is Act 1, from the creation of the world until the giving of the law at Sinai, the pre-Torah age, when people pretty much depended on their own instincts to try and know what's right and generally did a pretty lousy job of it. Act 2 is from the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai until the coming of the Messiah, and that's where we are now, where human nature is so unreliable that we have to be given laws telling us don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. And then, according to this view, we look forward to the curtain falling on the age of Torah and rising again on the Messianic era. On an era when human nature will have changed so radically that you won't need the Torah anymore. You won't need the Torah because people will be incapable of doing anything wrong. You won't have to tell them, don't do it. In their hearts, they will know not to do it. This is what we pray for when on Rosh Hashanah we talk about sounding the great shofar for our freedom and bringing in the Messianic era. An age when human nature will be radically different from the way it is now, when the lion will lie down with the lamb. Somewhere between those two extremes, is a wide range of opinions as to what the Messiah means. My own take, and once again I go back to cite my teacher with a capital T, Mordecai Kaplan, who said, a good parallel to the notion of Messiah is the concept of sovereign.
Oh, excuse me, what?
Sovereign. In the medieval world, the sovereign was one person, an emperor, a king, a czar, who had total control. In a democratic world, it's the will of the collective people that is sovereign. That is, we get to choose who our rulers are, and we get to tell them what we want. We get to throw them out of office if we don't like them. Dr. Kaplan said the word Messiah has undergone a very similar process of evolution. Originally, in biblical times, the Messiah is just an honest king, because that's all we need to fix things. As the situation became more and more dire, as we were oppressed by the Romans, the Messiah needed superhuman powers to get rid of this superhuman oppressor. And through much of European exile, that's the way they saw the Messiah. Nowadays, he would say, the Messiah represents the collective will of humanity. When people want there to be peace in the world so that they stop fighting over things, there'll be peace. Messiah doesn't have to come. We'll fix things first, and then the Messiah will come. Then there will be a world fit for the Messiah. When people want to stop cheating each other because they don't want to live in a world where you can't trust your neighbor, they will stop cheating each other. Then the Messianic era will come to the marketplace. And this, I think, is probably the one which would win the assent of most enlightened Jews today.
Similarly, someone asked a question in connection with the line, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And the questioner asks, is this as the Talmud often say, ba'olam hazeh or chaim ba'olam haba, the life in this world or life in the world to come? And curious about your interpretation of a world to come and on an afterlife, and what's your is it possible that the psalmist is referring to that, and what are your feelings about that?
You sure you don't want to ask me a question about translating the Hebrew?
I already asked you those questions. We can go back to that if you want.
I'm not sure what the psalmist had in mind. I doubt if he was talking about the world to come, because most of the psalms were written before the notion of a world to come was really widespread in traditional Judaism. It's very late in the biblical period, and I hold the opinion that most of the Psalms come from the First Temple times. So I don't think that's what the psalmist was talking about, although, of course, there's that passage attributed, I think, to Rabbi Akiva in the Haggadah, that the days of my life means this world, and all the days of my life is to include my existence in the afterlife. How do I picture the afterlife? I would have to say this. The only thing I know about what it means to die is that my body will stop functioning and be buried, and over the course of years return to the earth. But I believe there is a part of me which is not subject to death. It's everything about me which is not physical. It's my values, it's my memories, it's my relationships, it's my capacity for love, for courage, things which you can't locate with a biopsy. And because they are not physical, they cannot die. And so that survives. What I believe is that when I die, my physical body goes, and my non-physical body, my non-physical reality, which I'm comfortable calling a soul, and people less theologically inclined might want to call personality, that survives. But that's all I understand. I can't begin to understand what that means. What does it mean for my soul to exist without a body to incarnate it? Will I know who I am? Will I have a shape? Will I be able to recognize the non-corporeal souls of my son and my parents who died before me if I don't have eyes to see them with? And will I be happy to see them, to greet them, if I don't have glands to control my emotions? I can't understand what it means to exist without a body any more than a fetus can understand what it means to breathe air and wear clothes and ride a bicycle. So what I believe is something like this, with a high degree of tentativeness, and with the wish that it's many years before any of us find out.
Amen.
That my soul will survive in some manner which I cannot understand, but I don't depend on that for my immortality. My immortality, my living on, will be achieved by my daughter, by my grandchildren, by my students, by my books, by the deeds of kindness I have done, by the difference I will have made in this world. That's, the Olam Haba, the world to come. It occurred to me some years ago, that is a time reference, not a spatial reference. It's not a different place. It's a different time. Olam Haba, the world to come, means the future. I will live on in the future because people will read my books and listen to my talks, and my grandchildren will learn from me. And in that way, even when my physical body stops functioning, I'll be able to live on in the future. What the psalmist had in mind when he says, goodness and mercy shall pursue me all the days of my life, I suspect he's talking about this world. And if I were to ask him about a world to come, I think he'd be baffled. But with enough time to think about it, and with the spiritual sensitivity that he displays in his masterpiece of a poem, I think he'd come up with something good to say.
Last question specific to the text. And this is actually my question, and because I have troubled over this one for quite some time, and exactly what it means. The last line, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What is the house of the Lord? Is this the temple and only the temple, or
I used to think that line meant that services go on so long that you feel you're staying in God's house
You've been there forever, right?
I probably should have spoken about it in the course of my remarks. I think what that line displays is the spiritual growth of the psalmist. Starting out, the Lord is my shepherd. I am passive and God takes care of me. I am a sheep and he feeds me and protects me. And ending up with an almost reciprocal relationship with God. God not only cares for me the way a shepherd cares for his sheep, God invites me into his house. If it's a specific reference to the building in Jerusalem, the temple, I think he might start there and use that as a metaphor for coming into God's presence. Because, Rabbi Miller, that's what the temple was about. The temple was about a place that you would go to and feel you have come into God's presence. That's what contemporary temples and synagogues are about. A place which is not like anywhere else, which exists solely for the purpose of letting you feel you're in the presence of God. And I think what he's saying is, I used to believe in a God who existed to take care of me, the way I used to see my parents only in terms of their function of protecting and caring for me. But after everything I've gone through in my life and after everything I've learned and seen and experienced, I understand that what God offers me is not security, not a promise that nothing bad will happen. What God offers me is his company. What God offers me is the inestimable privilege of feeling that I am with him and he is with me. When a Jew recites a bracha, when a Jew says a blessing, let's say over lighting the Sabbath candles tomorrow night, what gives her the right to say, Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, O Lord, unless somehow she has conjured up the presence of God in the act of lighting the Sabbath candles, conjured up the presence of God in the act of putting on tefillin and reciting the Psalms, conjured up the act of God in the moment of saying a prayer of thanks for the food in front of him. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, I understand means I have dozens and dozens of opportunities every day of my life to be reminded that I'm in the presence of God. When I give charity to a panhandler on 92nd Street, when I pause to say a kind word to someone, when I forgive my wife for having disappointed or offended me, when I go out of my way to be charitable, financially charitable and emotionally charitable, when I observe the mitzvah of casting an informed vote for the government in this country, in all of those moments, I'm entitled to feel that I have come into the presence of God. And I think that's what he's saying, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Thank you. I thought for a second there we were going to get prognostication for the primaries, but leave that for informal discussion afterwards. The last two questions I'll present to you from our audiences are really the two sides of the same coin. Several people asked the question, what is the role of Psalms in your daily life? Clearly, you took a lot of time with this particular Psalm, but is tomorrow and on a regular basis, not just when you're speaking about it, but what is the role of Psalms in your life? And then the corollary question that a number of people asked in various forms was, how can they make Psalms a part of their life in the way you have done?
I'm tempted to say that the way they can make Psalms part of their life the way I have done is to spend their whole lives studying them. But I think that's a lot to ask of people.
Write their PhD dissertation on it also.
That's a good place to start. What do I do with the Psalms? Two ways. First, a significant number of them are used liturgically in the Jewish tradition, daily and Sabbath and holidays. And I recite them when we come to that part of the service. There's a line in the Talmud that says the Hasidim of rabbinic times would spend an hour reciting Psalms before they began to pray, because they realized, it's we rush in from the parking lot and try and get to services, and if you go to the weekday minyan, you rush through the services if you're double parked. The rabbis of the Talmud understood that the ability to pray is a very tricky skill. And it takes practice, like the ability to hit a golf ball takes practice, like skiing takes practice, like sewing takes practice, or cooking. And they said you can't just pick up the prayer book and start to read Hebrew and expect to get what it's about. They would use the Psalms as meditations. Sometimes I picture them listening very closely to the words of the Psalms. And sometimes I picture them just reciting Psalms that they know so well they can mumble them by heart. And at that point, I have a colleague who says that the words of the liturgy are meant to distract our left brain, our intellectual brain, so that our right brain can soar to heaven without embarrassment. Sometimes the Psalms are just meant as kind of intellectual busy work, so that the spiritual side of us can be free to exult in the presence of God. We read Psalms in the daily and Sabbath liturgy in imitation of those ancient worthies who felt they needed to warm up before they could pray seriously. So that's one of the ways I use the Psalms personally. The other, in the course of my life, there are maybe a dozen Psalms that I have made my own, that I have fastened on because they say something to me. The 30th Psalm that says, "Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning." The Psalm of Hallel that says, "Grievous in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones." The Psalm about who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord and who shall stand in your holy place, he who has clean hands and a pure heart. There are things that will happen in my life which just drive me to fall back on those Psalms. What should a person do who maybe was impressed by some of the things I said tonight and wants to incorporate the Psalms in his own spiritual life? It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard because we are not a poetry-oriented society. If you studied poetry in high school, you probably hated it, and if you memorized a few verses, it may still not be with you. It's going to be a challenge to read the Psalms either in English or in Hebrew and get anything out of them because we have not been taught to read poetry. If you're serious, there's no pill you can take, there's no quick course. Maybe the best thing you can do is get together regularly with 3 or 4 friends on the same wavelength as you are. Read the Psalms in whichever language you find it comfortable. There are a couple of books that offer commentaries on the Psalms, contemporary ones, but none of them are so good I could really recommend them enthusiastically. Try them, but read a Psalm and say to yourselves, what is this all about? And if your first response is, it doesn't say anything to me, look harder. Your homework is to find something worthwhile, something to talk about in this Psalm, and if you look at it long enough, you'll find it. Ask yourself the question, of the tens of thousands of liturgical poems that were written in days when the temple stood in Jerusalem. Only 150 were selected to be canonized in the Bible. There must have been something about this psalm that somebody thought made it special. Let's look at it and talk about it and read it aloud again and see if we can find it. And maybe in that way you will discover things, maybe even things the psalmist didn't have in mind, but they will speak loudly to you.
Rabbi Kushner, thank you very much. Thank you.